Okay, so I'm going to be talking you through what we've observed in pay for 2021. And we regularly collect and monitor pay outcomes all year through our in-house research, and we look at pay rises, pay freezes, and also deferred awards. And we use this information to produce regular analysis on trends, and I'll be presenting that to you today from our latest analysis. I'm also going to be covering a couple of key points to do with the pay round for 2021 that we found in our pay planning survey that we did this summer. Before I move on to my first slide, I just want to say thank you to everyone that supports our work, because without it, we wouldn't be able to describe the trends and give you an overall picture as I'm about to do. So let's get to my first slide. So this is a look at 2021 so far, and you can see here that the median pay award is 2% for the whole year, and this is based on a sample of 310 pay awards that we've monitored. So the first column on the table for whole economy is based on the whole sample, and you can see there that there's an interquartile range of awards between 1 and 2.5%. And our sample typically consists of medium to large size private sector companies. So in the second column along, you can see I've split the private sector out. And the main difference really from the whole economy there is that there is a higher upper quartile at 1.4%. So the next two columns along is that same private sector sample, but split into manufacturing and private services. And again, there's not too much difference. The lower quartile in private services is lower. And then the final two columns on the right-hand side show our samples and analysis for the not-for-profit and public sectors, which you can see is quite different from the economy as a whole and the private sector due to the median being lower. So this is the kind of analysis that we produce every month for our subscribers. And what we do is look at a picture for the previous 3 months, and we give supporting commentary with that. And this is produced on a rolling basis, so I will be looking at this data again at the end of the month, and I will be focusing on the 3 months to August to tell us the current median and trends. So that shows the current picture of the year. The main pay round is done for the year, but we do still have some autumn pay reviews to come in and collect. So we don't think that will alter the median for the year, but we'll be interested to see how the trend goes, and I'll be covering that in a short while. So just to give you a flavour of some of the pay outcomes that we see from major UK employers, and these are all included in our sample. Most deals here are in the 2 to 3% bracket, but we've got a couple of examples of a lower award for the Royal Mail Group. And also I just wanted to draw your attention to the 5% award for HM Revenue and Customs. So this award is quite unique. It's an average uplift, and it's part of a long-term deal that covers 3 years, and it was implemented under government guidance that allows for pay increases as long as they are accompanied by transformational workforce reform. So there were trade-offs on conditions that were part of that deal. So for example, hours were standardised and there was a reduction in unsocial hours pay, or to allow that to happen. So moving on, I wanted to show you what has happened to the trend. So the figures I went through on the last slide, we keep a picture of that and how it's looked for the previous 12 months. So leading up to the current figures, this slide is a breakdown of the figures per month. So as I mentioned earlier, we do look at the figures on a rolling 3-month basis, and this slide is showing how the lower quartile, median, average and upper quartile of pay awards has changed over the last year. So just to briefly talk you through the bullets, so each point, so starting with September 2020 on the left-hand side, those figures represent our sample of pay awards that were effective in July, August and September. October's points relate to August, September and October, so it moves along all the way up to the right-hand side for the July bullet points, and they are covering May, June and July this year. So turning to the median line, the purple line, as you can see, it's fairly static at 2%. We did have a dip in March, and that was at the end of the winter lockdown that we were all experiencing. And as I mentioned before, the overall median for the year this year has been 2%, and in 2020 the median pay award that we observed was 2.3%. The interquartile range, which is the difference between the black and the green lines, widened at the start of this year, but that was due to the number of pay freezes that we saw at that time. And I will come on to talk about freezes in a future slide. And as you can see on the right hand side, now that we've moved to July, some of the figures are going up. So we have seen they've been fairly stable for about 4 or 5 months, and we've seen a peak in the summer. So as I said, we'll be looking at this to see if that trend continues as we move into looking at the summer and autumn. So this chart is showing you the distribution of our sample of pay awards for last year and this year to show you the difference. So going straight to the centre of the chart, you can see that most awards are between 2 and 2.99%, and this is true for both years. However, this year it's 39% of awards, whereas last year it was around half of the sample. Just moving left slightly, the most significant change that we've seen just is in the 1 to 1.99% bracket. You can see it's completely different to last year, and now about a quarter of awards are in this bracket. Just briefly on freezes, there's not too much difference between this year and last year in terms of the proportion that we're seeing, but there was a significant change from 2019. So when we monitored awards freezes then, they were representing about 3% of our sample, and that shot up to 17% last year. We saw a lot of freezes in the pandemic, as I'm sure many of you know. And we have started to see them fall, but I'll be talking about that in another slide. So turning to the higher end of pay, awards that are above 3% are both on the right hand side in 2 separate columns, so you can see the split. So the first thing to notice is the fall in the number of awards worth 4% or more. There are various reasons for that, but one key reason is due to the national living wage. So last year, that increase was 6.2%, so we did see quite a few awards at that level. But this year, the increase was 2.2%, so that moved a lot of awards down a bracket. So all of these factors combined, the freezes, more lower awards and fewer higher awards, that's all contributed to the lower median overall this year. And one reason for that, so I'm going to be coming back to the sample for 2021, but first I just wanted to explain a couple of points as to why there may have been such differences between this year and last year. So many of you here today took part in our survey titled Pay Planning for 2022. We asked about 60 questions altogether, and it covered many aspects of pay and reward. And the analysis that we've done is based on responses from 83 organisations. Ken will be covering the bulk of that research and the findings in his presentation, but I just wanted to cover a point here about the 2021 pay round. So the question that we asked participants was about the level of increase they awarded in 2021 and how this compared to their original plans for the year. So around half, so 48% of employers told us that the increase was the same as they'd originally planned. However, 2/5 of the sample said that they did end up awarding a lower increase than they originally planned. We believe this is likely to be as a result of the uncertainty that many employers faced during the pandemic and the knock-on effects this year. So a smaller sample, 11%, awarded a higher increase than originally planned, and we saw all of the examples for that were in the private sector. So matched sample, we took a sample of around 200 awards for 2020 and we compared them to their 2021 pay outcome to see what had happened. What we found is this year 54% of awards for those groups were lower, 23% were at the same level and 23% were higher. Within that sample, there were 44 pay freezes from 2020, and just over half of these have had a pay rise this year, and this was most common in manufacturing. But the other half, so 48%, did have another freeze, and this was most common in our sample of the public sector. From speaking to employers, many of them said that they didn't think they could retain staff and remain competitive if they went ahead with another pay freeze this year. So now back to focusing on our trends for 2021. I'm going to talk you through the distribution of outcomes, in other words, the different levels of award this year, and I'll do a focus on freezes as well. So this is the same sample I was discussing earlier. However, I've broken it down here in the categories and brackets of percentages, but per sector. So manufacturing is in purple, private services in green, and then the not-for-profit in grey and public sector are in light blue. And as with the earlier slide, the data is working left to right. So starting with pay freezes on the left. So I'm going to focus firstly on the private sector, which is represented in the purple and green columns. Both of these areas have their largest cluster of awards in the 2 to 2.99% bracket. And around a fifth of awards in both these areas are worth 3% or more overall. But we have found one thing to note is awards for private services, the bulk of those higher end awards are in the 4% bracket, whereas manufacturing, the bulk of that sample is in the 3 to 3.99% bracket. We found within that sample in manufacturing, increases such as in companies in industries such as chemicals, pharmaceuticals and oil are falling into that category. Within private services, the higher end awards that we're seeing of more than 4% are largely in retail, road transport, and it's companies, for example, Morrison's, they introduced a minimum rate of £10 this year, which meant over an 8% uplift in their minimum rate. So that they're sitting in that bracket, and that's we're seeing more of those larger increases in those two industries. Generally, awards below 2% aren't very common in the private sector, but we have seen continued freezes, and these are common in air transport and in engineering, or certain parts of engineering. So moving to the not-for-profit sector, awards are generally lower there as per the median I mentioned earlier, and that's due to nearly half of all awards falling into the 1 to 1.99% bracket, which you can see at 46%. Freezes and lower end awards represent just over a fifth of outcomes in this area, such as care, services and housing, and in charities. But the public sector does have the most freezes, not surprisingly, considering the announcement from the government on the public sector pay restraint. However, on the public sector, higher end awards have gone ahead, and that includes awards for the NHS and HMRC that I mentioned on the table earlier in my slides. So moving on, I just want to cover pay freezes and the trends we've seen. So it's showing our latest analysis. Sorry. Thank you. So each point of the line represents the proportion of freezes in our sample for the 3 months ending at each date. So for example, as similar to my other slides, so the bullet point for March represents the freezes and the proportion that we had for effective dates in January, February and March last year. So what we saw in 2019, as I said, freezes represented about 3% of our sample, and this grew to 17% last year and is now 19% this year. Freezes definitely became more common in 2020, with a peak in the summer at 32%. Before falling again, and this was a result of a growing number of private sector freezes that we saw at that time. There were also a lot of freezes in the not-for-profit sector, but the numbers were quite steady. And then as we moved into 2021, the proportion of freezes has fallen in the private sector, but as I say, remains steady in not-for-profit. But the biggest change we've seen is the number of freezes in the public sector. So as we moved into 2021, instances of pay freezes peaked again in the early part of the year at 30% in the 3 months to March, and then they have gradually fallen down to 9% for our summer sample. Last year, we did carry out some research to determine the types of employee groups that were impacted by freezes. And looking at the sample, for it was around half of the cases were across the board freezes, so every employee was affected within an organisation. But for the other half, we found that it only applied to particular groups, so either management or white collar staff. So the uncertainty from the pandemic has certainly caused uncertainty, but we have observed also an increase in the number of employers deferring their pay decision for 2020 and 2021. And I'll talk you through that analysis next. So deferred awards, we monitored the conclusion of 67 deferred awards that would have been effective between 2020 and 2021. And our survey contains examples from across the economy, and consequently the results are quite varied, but bear with me, I'll just talk you through these responses. So from the sample we had, 35% implemented pay rises later than their usual effective date. So that meant that the increase covered a shorter period of time, so less than a year. And we saw examples of 6-month awards, 9-month, 10 months. And so, for example, we had a retailer we spoke to whose anniversary was April. They didn't implement a pay rise till later in the year. And that meant the award was shorter, but they did maintain their April pay anniversary the following year, so it was restored. And actually, we found that in all of those cases, everybody that delayed their award did return to their normal anniversary the next year. So moving to the second line, the findings, 28% of the sample of delayed awards were those that were implemented, but the employers backdated the pay, so that they may have made their decision later in the year, but they did implement a pay rise and backdate it to the normal anniversary. So further, just skipping over the next line and moving to the fourth line of the chart, 10% of the sample also implemented a pay rise at a later date, but they have permanently moved their anniversary date. So we found that some employers who had managers increases on 1 month, employee increases on another month, now aligned all of their anniversaries together. So looking at the whole sample, the majority of them, so 3/4 of them, did implement a pay rise of some description. So despite the delays, staff did have a pay rise, but we found that around a quarter, 24%, after delaying the award, a freeze was then implemented. So this is my final slide, and it's returning back to some of the analysis from our pay planning survey to show you how employers in the study have responded to pay pressures. So in another question, we gave this list of options as a please tick all of these that apply. Generally, we found that pay pressures are rising, and it seems to be with the top few answers suggesting that employers are firefighting by targeting pay for specific roles in order to respond to pressures. So the top 2 lines cover responses or actions that are taken in response to particular roles rather than generic across the board increases. The third line, we could also argue that the third line for pay increases targeted at specific groups of staff. That depends on how big the group of staff is. So if it's a large number of employees or a large negotiated group, you generally could describe that as an across the board pay rise. And what we find with those, with going back to the top 2 lines, they are a lower cost to implement, but might address some perhaps recruitment and retention issues. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, but I do want to say thank you again to everybody that takes part in our research.